Thanks everyone for being here. And Ruth, thank you for doing the acknowledgement. In this work that I'm going to talk about in terms of First Nations participation, I think probably that's an area that we could do much work on and do much better than is currently happening in the disaster field. So certainly one that has some great potential to contribute to our understandings of disasters. So I just wanted to acknowledge the other people who I've been working with. So Amanda Howard, Pam Joseph, Pam's online, hi Pam, Kate Masola, Miriam Beavis, Megan Cataract Harris, and Dara Sampson. So this kind of bunch of people have been working together on a range of projects. So similar to Sasha, this is a storyline of ongoing learning. I think it's quite important in terms of research for us to be thinking about these are not one-off projects. You know, we get funded to do one-off projects as if we kind of compartmentalize our interests into a project. In fact, these are long-term relationships and long-term interests. So the work that we've been doing feels like a long time now, has been around climate change and the increasing frequency and severity of natural disasters and problematizing that notion of natural, you know, because they're human-induced natural disasters. If you looked at the Australian media, you probably wouldn't pick this up, but Australia is recognised as being at the forefront of climate change. We're at the cutting edge of the worst elements of climate change now. That's what's going on when you see bushfires that destroy thousands of hectares and homes and native bush and native animals. And when you see the flood that picture's from ended up at 11.5 metres. So that's a 9 metre gauge. 1 in 5,000 year flood, right? That doesn't happen in 1 in 5,000 years anymore. That's happening on a regular basis. So what we're seeing in Australia is communities across the country experiencing disasters in a really profoundly, and even more people who are vulnerable to the next disaster. You know, so there's a sense of doom happening. What we know from, and you'll know this from just watching anything on the news, these are the sorts of words people use when they talk about disasters. They talk about feeling overwhelmed, forgotten, nobody came. You know, that's a really common experience from people where they've got this assumption that there's this system out there that's going to come and keep them safe. You know, that's the kind of social contract they've got with government, is that someone will come and keep them safe, but nobody comes. They're left to themselves. So the images here are of communities, you know, the Tin Army rescues in Lismore is one that's got a lot of media images associated with it, but people are doing that all the time in all sorts of small ways. I wanted to include the snake image because that for many communities is extraordinarily distressing when the disasters impact on not only the human creatures in that place. So what's happening when people feel these things, we think, this is our analysis, is that when an event happens, you don't have the SES sitting there ready to go. They're just doing whatever they're doing, or real fire, you know, they're just doing what they were doing. The event happens. The first people who are there, who are responders, are untrained and unprepared community members. They're neighbours, they're people down the street, they're the local publican, they're whoever. They're not emergency service people. They're not trained in any way. They just notice that the neighbour down the street can't get out of a house and they go and help her get out of a house. we need to be very careful about this storyline of formal services are failing. Formal services are overwhelmed. And when you get them in a private room, they'll say that. They'll say, we cannot rescue people. So there was a tail end of a cyclone in the Northern Rivers well before the Lismore thing called Cyclone Debbie that had major impact on communities up there. And there was a community we were working in a place called Ocean Shores, just north of Brunswick Heads. They had, when that cyclone hit, 3 members of the SES in that region. 3 members. Like, how on earth are they going to rescue anyone? Could barely rescue themselves, let alone anyone else. The other stuff that we're seeing that contributes to this, nobody came, they left us alone, we were forgotten, is that all of our technological systems just collapse. Okay, so nobody, everyone's like, oh, fire near me. Well, that's fine until the fire near me mobile system goes down, right? And then you're left with, I don't know what's going on here. I've got no information. I don't know whether I should leave, whether I should stay. Is it safe? What are my kids doing? I can't ring the school. The school's phones are down. We have so many assumptions about our mobile systems. Internet being that, everyone's going to be on the internet. Well, no, they won't be if the whole infrastructure disappears, which it does regularly. The other thing that is contributing to this sense of being overwhelmed is that many of our infrastructures aren't built for disasters. It's like we've got these systems that are not fit for purpose anymore. So we have power systems in one of the communities that we've been working in. They lost all power at 6 p.m. in a flood for the whole region because one of the power transferers went underwater, and that it just went. Now, if that was designed well, that probably shouldn't have happened. But we've got this infrastructure that's not designed for purpose. So people have all of those things. People feel overwhelmed, distressed, and then they carry that. That doesn't just happen on the event. That happens afterwards as well. So what we're seeing in our work is that communities all over Australia are no longer waiting for government to rescue them or solve the issue. Communities are now deciding to act because of those experiences of being overwhelmed, unprepared, realising that they are the first responders. It's not going to be someone else dealing with it, it will be them. So our research, and there's a couple of pictures of the people we've worked with here, is about walking alongside those communities that are trying to act, trying to be supportive, trying to add useful information as we can, learning from what they're doing, learning about what does community-led disaster preparedness and response look like, what works well, what doesn't, where are the things that are the opportunities, and where are the things that actually hinder. So trying to map that all out. And then this morning we had a session where this was with community in Megalong Valley, where, what have I done? Close that. How long's that been up there?
Just then.
Oh, yeah. Good. I thought you might have been going, oh, it's there for half an hour, I'm not going to tell her. The importance of sharing these stories with other communities. So what communities are doing pretty clearly is they're wanting to learn from each other. They're wanting opportunities to listen and learn from each other. So there's some of the communities we've worked with over the last 7 years. And you can see, well, maybe you can't, but there's a very diverse range of communities. And partly that is deliberate as researchers. So WeWar is this tiny little, place with 3,000 or 4,000 people up on the northern plains. Large Indigenous community there, very water sensitive community. But interestingly, when we were working, I'm not going to go through all these, but I just will say a couple. When we were working in Weewar, they'd been coming to the tail end of like a 12-year drought, but the disaster funding didn't see drought as a disaster. And so they kept saying to the community, no, we can't talk about drought. We want to talk about flood. And the community's going, bring it on, you know, let it rain. So communities up on the northern rivers and north coast, the Hawkesbury. Every time I think about the Hawkesbury, I despair. Since the big flood in 56, we've put 1.5 million people vulnerable on a floodplain. That place will flood soon. And it's like 1.5 million. I can't even begin to think of how chaotic. And many of those people, the work we've done in the Nepean has been with social housing residents. So people who don't have a car to get into to drive away. You know, they're low income, older people who are on oxygen. You know, what are they going to do? There's no, you know, like, anyway. So the Hawkesbury's a place to be worried about. And then, you know, range of communities in Victoria as well. We've just started a new project in Loxton in South Australia, which will be very exciting, but also doing work in high rises like Redfern and Surrey Hills. So this kind of eclectic bunch of communities are all acting on disaster. And that's really fascinating from a research perspective. Like, what are they experiencing? Why are they doing this stuff? People do extraordinary work. There's a group that we're working with in Dargan, Clarence and Bell, which is up on the Bell Line, extreme west of the Bell Line on the Blue Mountains, producing like Department of Planning level resilience plans as a bunch of volunteers who are concerned about their community, like extraordinary levels of data and analysis that they're doing. So doing fabulous work. So what we do is we do action research. So that's that idea of walking alongside people. It's an iterative process where we're constantly feeding back to communities what we're seeing, what we're hearing, what we've learnt from other places. So it's a very active research role. It's you know, we feel like we become friends with our community people. It's not like this objective, you know, we're just here to measure a relationship. And so we do quite a lot of what we think of as collaborative knowledge building, where we try to capture what people are saying and doing and experiencing. And we've got this model that we've developed from all of those communities over a number of years about what we think communities should, could, and are paying attention to be prepared for the next disaster. So some people call it resilience building, but we've had huge feedback from people that they hate that word, so we don't want to use it. So we call it preparedness. It's a bit cumbersome, but it's just trying to respect what people are saying. So there are 7 dimensions that people pay attention to. So things like, who makes decisions in the community? How are those decisions made? How is community voice included in decision making? Networks, what networks are active? How are they mobilised? Information. The information one's really interesting because when we do this to emergency services, they go, oh, here's a fridge magnet. It's like, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the information in this room and it's coming this way. You know, that it's actually a two-way process where the community knowledge could inform emergency services. Radical thought. So information, self-organising. So Again, emergency services don't like that idea, that they call them rogues, these rogue communities who are out there doing their own stuff because they're not playing by the rules. It's like, well, the rules aren't there when the chaos breaks loose. They've got to have their own capacity to save their neighbour or whatever it is they want to do. Get, you know, in the Hawkesbury, they organise a informal medication service because people get cut off from where they can get their drugs, you know, whether it's diabetes drugs or heart, whatever it happens to be. Communities do that themselves with the, you know, local chemist being on site, blah, blah, blah. So self-organising, something to pay attention to. Inclusion, who's at the table, who's not. How do we get more people involved in this process? You don't want a community preparedness strategy that misses a whole part of the community. So that's one we're constantly banging on with them about. Who's not here? Who's not here? We know you're here, but who's not here? And communication strategies. So this one's really important when an event happens. How are people going to communicate? If someone says, oh, we'll use the mobile phone, we go, let's not use the mobile phone because we know it's not going to work. What's plan B? And resources. How are resources, what form do resources take and how are they brought into the community? In that town of Yagara, which is a tiny little town of 600 people, the minister turns up and announces that there'll be a $5 million shed built for the truck, for the fire truck. $5 million in that town would have done a huge amount of benefit. Instead, it's going to a builder who is from Sydney, who'll come in town, build this shed, and then it's kind of like, well, that's nice. It'll be a nice shed until it floats away. You know, not a good use of resources. So we do a lot of imaging rather than writing, and we do a lot of talking. How's that one? You reckon you can see any of that? This is a story. So this is what we do. We do these storytellings with communities. This is a community in Whittlesea in Victoria, and they had, we asked them, you know, how did you get to, tell me about, the starting of the conversation was, tell me about how you got to today. And they took, and today was over here, and they took us way back to the mid-1990s was when it all started. Now, we wouldn't have gotten that story except for this technique of opening up conversations and trying to illustrate back to people. And what this one does is it does tell a story in the blue, but in the orange are all the messages that they want to give other people. So they want to give other communities, you will be ignored. Don't give up. Persistence is important. There'll be moments where you think you've made progress and then you'll go back again. You know, so there's these little hints that they've built into that message. And that's another one that's more straightforward, which was about the interaction with the formal system around information. So this is a community that had a very advanced and sophisticated information system already in place around a flood that was completely dismissed. You know, no, you don't need to do that. What you need to do is this. And in this case, it was have a generator and some sandbags. That was the answer. Where in fact, the local communities had some strategies that they'd had in place for years. So in the end, what happens is the formal system goes off on its little tangent. The informal system does what it wants to do because it's always done that and knows it'll work. And what we do with these sorts of stories, they're really helpful to kind of go to communities. These are some dead ends, you know, that other people have come up against. And that's a bit reassuring. It's that stuff where, you know, if someone else has had it, you kind of feel a bit better. You feel so exceptional. But it's also useful for service systems to go, you're creating a dead end here. You know, we can tell you that this is not going to work well when you come with the solution, the information solution for communities. So that's us. Thank you. Oh, it's very cool work. So much fun.
Okay.
So much better than trying to do it yourself. Just watching other people do it.
So are there any questions for Margot? Amazing scope of possibility. I guess I could ask you a question.
You could, yep.
I think it would be really interesting. Obviously, there's the whole community development perspective for social work, but I wonder, carrying on from Sasha's critical kind of engagement with what social workers do, whether you have looked at what social workers do in disaster responses in those communities.
Very similar concerns to Sasha about the assumptions that services are good. We have quite regularly seen services act as if they're proxy for community, try and position themselves between particularly funders and communities, and kind of going, oh, well, you can fund us because we're community, rather than, and often what you can see there is, you know, services are good at doing funding submissions and good at managing funders. A bunch of residents who might actually be at the front line doing fabulous work, they don't have those skill set, so they get excluded. So stuff that we write about in terms of services and social work is to be really careful about crowding out genuine community participation. Not, you know, it's not everyone does it. So some people do it really well and are really able to support community processes and self-organizing. But there's such a need, there's such a kind of drive to formalize everything, you know, to make it look like us from the funder's perspective, you know, that the funder wants something nice and neat. You know, they want someone who's calls themselves a CEO or a, you know, CFO or something that they can deal with, not this kind of messy bunch of people who don't even have a bank account, let alone an identity of any sort. Yeah. Yeah, Sasha's just said that only particular types of outcomes get measured or valued. And one of the big tensions that I see in this field that's kind of interesting is that there's this overwhelming desire for order in a space that is completely disordered. You know, that people feel so uncomfortable about the messiness. You know, they stick on their uniform and they want some order. And it's like, yeah, not happening, you know. So there's this real tension between neoliberal, patriarchal, colonial systems and what people are doing on the ground.
Are there any
Joel?
Yeah.
Friends.
It's such fascinating stuff and so real on the ground. What's the scope to scale this? What you know, I'm thinking my family lived through Blue Mountains bushfires and I wish that we had you there, you know, in the months prior. What's the scope to get this rolled out across the rest of Australia stat?
Yeah, there are a lot of people doing really good work in the disaster field. Lots of researchers out there doing this stuff and trying to support better community capacities around disasters. So, you know, not going to take on that it's our responsibility. There are lots of us doing this together. We do have a half-built website that will try and explain some of this stuff in plain English, as well as have lots of voices of people who've done it, like community members in that website, to try and the thing that's really a priority for us at the moment is to share these stories. They're not our stories, to share the stories of people doing this work. yeah, it's such really it is quite a privilege to be in the room with people who've done this really hard, serious social investment over years. So the more that's where we're at the moment, is to try and not really scale it up, but to share, because each community will adapt it themselves.
Wow, thanks, Margot.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Oh,
No, online.
Lubna has a question.
Oh, look, that's a question. Great.
Lubna, do you want to speak? I think we can hear you.
Yeah, so I have a question in terms of like Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledges and how much space is made for those types of knowledges. And I'm thinking specifically in the sense of, you know, traditional knowledges about the land and what works in disasters or to avoid disasters. Are they taken on in any capacity, whether it be formally or informally, Margot?
I think there are some improvements happening, Lubna. When we were doing some work in WeWar that I mentioned before, that is a very strongly First Nations community. Maybe 40% of the community is First Nations, so it's a strongly bicultural community. And that community decided that what it wanted to do was a cultural country tour, where they would teach the Indigenous residents would teach others about this country and what they needed to know about this country. And the funding bodies found it extraordinarily hard to see that had anything to do with disasters. It's like, yeah, well, they're trying to tell you about how the river will flow. It will, you know, they're trying to tell you what those trees that you're about to remove will do if you remove them. You know, that reading of country, that knowledge. So we've seen bits of it. In our latest project, which is on water futures in the Murray-Darling Basin, just a small task. First Nations knowledges are absolutely central to that initiative, and a lot of really careful work has been done to include those knowledges. So I'm not going to say it's all there, but I think there's some goodwill and some good learning happening. Lubna?
Thanks, Margot.
Thanks very much, Margot.